The winter of 1882 had been particularly brutal across the Arizona Territory. Snow blanketed the rugged landscape in a way that old-timers claimed they hadn't seen in decades. The harsh winds cut through the canyon walls like invisible blades, carrying with them the bitter promise of death for anyone caught unprepared in the wilderness. Thomas McKenna pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his horse through the narrow mountain pass. At 43, he had spent the better part of his life in these unforgiving lands, first as a cavalry scout, then as a rancher, trying to carve out an existence in territory that seemed determined to reject any form of civilization. His weathered face bore the scars of countless encounters with both nature and man, deep lines etched around his grey eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the desert sun and mountain snow alike. The horse beneath him, a sturdy bay mare named Susanna, picked her way carefully through the drifted snow. Her breath came in great puffs of white vapor that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Thomas had been riding since before dawn, following rumors of cattle rustlers who had been plaguing the scattered ranches in the area. The territorial marshal had put together a small posse, but they had disbanded 2 days earlier when the storm hit with unprecedented fury. Now, as the pale winter sun struggled to penetrate the heavy grey clouds overhead, Thomas found himself alone in a landscape that seemed more hostile than usual. The familiar landmarks were obscured by snow, and even with his extensive knowledge of the territory, he found himself relying more on instinct than sight to navigate the treacherous terrain. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of snow under Susanna's hooves and the occasional whistle of wind through the rock formations. It was the kind of silence that could drive a man to madness if he let it, the kind that made him question whether he was the last living soul in a world that had been abandoned by God himself. As they crested a small ridge, Thomas paused to survey the valley below. What he saw made his blood run cold. Scattered across the pristine white expanse were dark shapes that could only be bodies. Even from this distance he could make out the distinctive clothing and weapons that marked them as Apache warriors. The snow around them was stained dark with blood that had long since frozen, creating a macabre contrast against the otherwise peaceful winter scene. Thomas had seen enough battlefields in his time to recognize a massacre when he saw one. The bodies were arranged in no particular pattern, suggesting a running fight rather than a planned ambush. Some lay crumpled near what appeared to be the remains of a hastily constructed shelter, while others were spread out across the valley floor, as if they had been trying to flee when they were cut down. He urged Susanna down the slope, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the grip of his Colt revolver. The mare seemed to sense the tension in her rider and moved with cautious steps, her ears swiveling constantly as she searched for any sign of danger. The snow was deeper here in the valley, reaching nearly to the horse's belly in some places, making their progress slow and laborious. As they drew closer to the scene of carnage, Thomas could make out more details that painted a grim picture of what had transpired. The Apache had been caught in the open, probably traveling to winter camp when the storm hit. They had tried to construct emergency shelters from whatever materials they could find, but it appeared that their enemies had found them before they could properly fortify their position. The attackers had been thorough and merciless. Men, women, and elderly members of the band had all been killed without discrimination. Thomas counted at least 20 bodies scattered across the valley, their forms already partially buried by the continuing snowfall. The sight filled him with a familiar mixture of revulsion and sadness that he had hoped never to feel again after leaving his military service behind. He had fought against Apache warriors in his younger days, following orders and doing what he believed was his duty to protect settlers and maintain order in the territory. But he had never been comfortable with the wholesale slaughter of non-combatants, and the sight before him brought back memories of similar scenes that still haunted his dreams on quiet nights. Susanna snorted nervously as they moved through the killing ground, her nostrils flaring at the scent of death that permeated the area despite the cold. Thomas spoke to her in low, soothing tones, trying to keep both of them calm as he searched for any sign of survivors. Experience had taught him that even in the aftermath of such violence, there was always a chance that someone had managed to hide or escape the initial attack. The wind picked up again, sending swirls of snow dancing across the valley floor and obscuring his vision. Thomas pulled his hat down lower over his eyes and continued his methodical search, checking each body for signs of life, even though he knew it was likely futile. The cold would have claimed anyone who had been merely wounded, and the thoroughness of the attack suggested that the killers had taken time to ensure there were no survivors. It was near what appeared to have been the central shelter that Thomas heard it, a sound so faint that he almost dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his ears. But Susanna heard it too, her ears pricking forward and her head turning toward a pile of debris that had once been a makeshift lean-to constructed from branches and animal hides. Thomas dismounted carefully, his boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunching sound. He approached the debris pile with his revolver drawn, not entirely sure what he might find beneath the tangle of branches and torn hide. The sound came again, weak but unmistakably human, a small, whimpering cry that seemed to cut through the winter air like a knife through his heart. Working quickly but carefully, Thomas began clearing away the debris. His hands, despite the cold, worked with practiced efficiency as he moved branches and pulled away sections of hide that had been weighted down by snow. The crying became more distinct as he worked, and he realized with growing amazement that he was listening to the sounds of an infant. When he finally cleared away the last of the covering material, Thomas found himself staring down at a sight that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Wrapped in a traditional Apache cradle board and nestled in a small hollow that had been carved into the earth beneath the shelter was a baby girl who appeared to be no more than a few months old. The infant was barely conscious, her tiny lips blue with cold and her breathing shallow and rapid. She had been protected from the worst of the elements by the makeshift shelter and the natural insulation provided by the earth. But it was clear that she would not have survived much longer in the frigid conditions. Her dark eyes, when they fluttered open, seemed to look directly at Thomas with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young. Thomas holstered his weapon and knelt in the snow beside the cradleboard, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. He had no experience with infants, had never even held one in his adult life. But he knew that every second counted if he was going to save this child's life. The cradleboard itself was a work of art, decorated with intricate beadwork and painted symbols that spoke of the love and care that had gone into its creation. "Easy there, little one," Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've got you now." He carefully lifted the cradleboard from its earthen nest, marveling at how light it was despite the substantial construction. The baby stirred at the movement, letting out a weak cry that seemed to echo across the silent valley. Thomas could see that she was wrapped in soft doe skin and rabbit fur, traditional materials that had probably saved her life by providing insulation against the deadly cold. As he stood holding the child, Thomas felt a profound shift in his understanding of the world around him. This was not just another casualty of the ongoing conflict between settlers and native peoples. This was a human being, innocent and helpless, whose survival now depended entirely on his actions. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, but it was one he knew he would gladly bear. The wind was getting stronger, and Thomas knew he needed to get the child to warmth and shelter as quickly as possible. He looked around the valley one more time, his trained eye searching for any clues about who might have been responsible for the massacre. The tracks were largely obscured by the continuing snowfall, but what he could see suggested that the attackers had been well armed and numerous. There were boot prints mixed in with moccasin tracks, indicating that at least some of the killers had been white men. This was not uncommon in the territory, where conflicts between different groups often involved multiple parties with varying motives. Some might have been soldiers acting on official orders, others could have been civilian volunteers, or even outlaws taking advantage of the chaos to settle old scores. Thomas carefully secured the cradle board to his saddle, making sure it was positioned where he could keep a close eye on the infant during the ride back to civilization. The nearest settlement was Fort Bowie, a military outpost about 30 miles to the south. But Thomas knew that the journey through the storm-lashed mountains would be treacherous even under the best of conditions. As he prepared to mount Susanna, Thomas took one last look around the Valley of Death. The snow was already beginning to obscure the bodies, nature's way of providing a blanket for the dead. By spring, when the snows melted, there would be little evidence of what had transpired here, except for scattered bones and the memories of those who had witnessed the aftermath. "Someone will pay for this," Thomas muttered under his breath, his words barely audible above the wind. "But not you, little girl. You're going to live." The ride back toward Fort Bowie was a nightmare of cold and treacherous footing. Thomas had to constantly adjust his route to avoid areas where the snow had drifted too deeply or where the terrain was too unstable for safe passage. Susanna struggled gamely through the drifts, her sturdy legs and mountain-bred endurance the only things keeping them moving forward through the storm. Every few minutes, Thomas would check on the baby, relieved each time to hear her weak cries or see the slight movement of her breathing beneath the wrappings. He had fashioned a crude windbreak, using his own coat to protect the cradleboard from the worst of the weather. But he knew that his makeshift arrangements were far from adequate for a prolonged journey. The temperature continued to drop as darkness approached, and Thomas began to seriously worry about whether they would be able to make it to the fort before hypothermia claimed all three of them. His own extremities were becoming numb despite his heavy clothing, and he could feel Susanna beginning to falter beneath him as the accumulated stress of the journey took its toll. It was then that he remembered the old line shack that had been built in these mountains by prospectors years earlier. If his memory served him correctly, it should be no more than a few miles from their current position, nestled in a grove of pines that would provide some protection from the wind. The structure had been abandoned for several years, but it would at least offer shelter from the storm and a chance to build a fire. Changing course slightly, Thomas guided Susanna toward what he hoped was the location of the shack. The visibility was now so poor that he could barely see more than a few yards in any direction, and he found himself relying entirely on his sense of direction and familiarity with the terrain to navigate. Just when he was beginning to think that he had miscalculated their position, the dim outline of the cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage in the desert. The structure was smaller than he remembered and showed signs of significant weather damage, but it appeared to be intact enough to provide the shelter they desperately needed. Thomas dismounted and led Susanna to the lee side of the building, where a crude lean-to provided some protection for the horse. He quickly removed the cradleboard from the saddle and carried it inside the cabin, his frozen fingers fumbling with the simple wooden latch that secured the door. The interior of the shack was dark and cold, but it was blissfully free of the driving wind that had been their constant companion for hours. Thomas set the cradleboard down carefully on what appeared to be an old table and began the process of building a fire in the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the single room. The previous occupants had left behind a small supply of dried wood, and Thomas was grateful to find that the chimney drew properly when he lit the kindling. Soon, a small but warming fire was crackling merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough log walls and filling the space with the comforting scent of burning pine. As the cabin began to warm, Thomas carefully removed the baby from her cradleboard and examined her more closely in the firelight. She was definitely Apache, with the characteristic features and coloring of her people, but she was also clearly very young, probably no more than 3 or 4 months old based on his limited knowledge of infant development. The child's breathing had improved with the warmth, and her color was beginning to return to normal. She opened her dark eyes and looked up at Thomas with what seemed like curiosity rather than fear, as if she somehow understood that he represented safety in a world that had suddenly become very dangerous. "What am I going to do with you?" Thomas asked softly, more to himself than to the infant. "I don't know the first thing about taking care of a baby, especially not an Apache baby." The question of what to do with the child was indeed a complex one. The logical course would be to turn her over to the military authorities at Fort Bowie, who would presumably find some way to reunite her with surviving members of her tribe, if any existed. But Thomas had seen enough of military justice to know that the fate of one Apache infant would not be high on anyone's list of priorities. There was also the very real possibility that the child would be seen as nothing more than a burden to be disposed of as quickly and quietly as possible. The ongoing conflicts between settlers and native peoples had created an atmosphere where any show of mercy or compassion toward the enemy was often viewed with suspicion and contempt. As Thomas pondered these troubling thoughts, he began to examine the cradle board and its contents more carefully. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of someone who had devoted considerable time and love to its creation. The beadwork incorporated traditional Apache designs that told stories and conveyed blessings for the child's future, while the carved wooden frame showed evidence of careful attention to both function and beauty. Wrapped with the infant were several small items that appeared to have spiritual or ceremonial significance. There was a tiny pouch containing what looked like pollen or ground herbs, a small carved figure of what might have been a protective spirit, and a piece of turquoise that had been worked into the shape of a bird in flight. These items told Thomas that the child had been precious to her family, probably their first daughter, or perhaps the child of someone of particular importance within the band. The thought that such love and hope had been extinguished by violence filled him with a deep sadness that went beyond his usual reaction to the brutal realities of frontier life. The baby began to fuss as the warmth of the fire penetrated her coverings, and Thomas realized with growing concern that she was probably hungry. He had no idea what to feed an infant, particularly one who had likely been nursed by her mother until the massacre occurred. The thought of the child's mother, probably lying frozen in the snow just a few miles away, brought a tightness to his throat that he tried to push away. Thomas searched through his meager supplies, looking for anything that might be suitable for an infant. He had some jerky and hardtack, standard trail rations that would be completely inappropriate for someone so young. There was also a small amount of coffee and sugar, but again, nothing that would provide proper nourishment for a baby. In desperation, he tried mixing a small amount of sugar with water warmed by the fire, creating a thin syrup that he hoped might at least provide some energy for the child. Using a clean piece of cloth as a makeshift nipple, he managed to get a few drops of the mixture into the baby's mouth. The infant seemed to accept the improvised feeding, though Thomas knew it was far from adequate for her nutritional needs. He would have to find a better solution quickly, or all his efforts to save her life would be in vain. The nearest source of proper infant care would be Fort Bowie, where the wives of some of the soldiers might be able to provide guidance and assistance. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself settling into an uneasy routine of tending the fire, checking on the baby, and trying to come up with a plan for the next day. The storm showed no signs of abating, and he knew that traveling through the mountains in such conditions would be extremely dangerous, even without the added responsibility of caring for an infant. The child slept fitfully, waking periodically to cry weakly before settling back into restless slumber. Each time she stirred, Thomas felt his anxiety increase, knowing that her condition was likely deteriorating despite the warmth and makeshift feeding. He found himself talking to her in low, soothing tones, not because he expected her to understand, but because the sound of his own voice helped to dispel the oppressive silence of the storm-bound cabin. "I don't know your name, little one," he whispered, as he adjusted her coverings. "I don't even know if your people gave you a name yet, or if that was something they were waiting to do when you got older." Eddie. Thomas had heard that Apache children were often given temporary names at birth, with their permanent names being bestowed later based on their personalities or significant events in their lives. This child's permanent name would now forever be influenced by the tragic circumstances of her rescue, assuming she survived long enough to need one. As the fire burned lower, Thomas found himself drifting between wakefulness and exhaustion-induced sleep. In his dreams, he saw the faces of the dead Apache in the valley, their eyes accusing him of some unnamed crime. He saw the child's mother, a young woman whose face his imagination constructed from a combination of memory and guilt, reaching out to reclaim her daughter from the arms of a stranger. When he woke with a start in the early hours of morning, Thomas found that the storm had finally begun to subside. Through the single small window of the cabin, he could see hints of pale sunlight struggling through the breaking clouds. The wind had dropped to a whisper, and the constant sound of driving snow against the walls had ceased. The baby was awake and looking at him with those disturbing dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for an infant. She was not crying, but Thomas could sense that she was weaker than she had been the night before. The improvised sugar water had not been sufficient to sustain her, and he knew that time was running out if he was going to save her life. Thomas quickly rebuilt the fire and prepared for the final push to Fort Bowie. The improved weather conditions would make travel possible, though still dangerous, given the depth of snow and the likelihood of hidden obstacles beneath the pristine white surface. Susanna seemed to sense that they would be moving again soon, and stamped her feet restlessly in the lean-to. As he prepared to leave the temporary sanctuary of the cabin, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of both his life and that of the child he had rescued. Instead of simply delivering her to the military authorities as he had originally planned, he would insist on being involved in determining her future. She had survived against impossible odds, and he felt a responsibility to ensure that her survival had meaning beyond mere chance. "We're going to make it, little girl," Thomas said, as he carefully secured the cradleboard for travel. "And when we do, I'm going to make sure you get the life you deserve, no matter what it takes." The morning sun was bright, but provided little warmth as Thomas guided Susanna out of the protected valley where the cabin stood and back onto the main trail toward Fort Bowie. The snow sparkled like scattered diamonds in the clear air, creating a beauty that contrasted sharply with the grim purpose of their journey. Behind them, the Valley of the Dead remained silent under its blanket of snow, holding its secrets until the spring thaw would reveal them to scavengers and investigators alike. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also hope. The hope that one innocent life could be preserved from the violence and hatred that seemed to define this harsh land. Thomas McKenna rode toward an uncertain future, carrying with him a child whose very existence would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, loyalty, and the meaning of family. The journey to Fort Bowie would take most of the day, but the real journey, the one that would transform both rescuer and rescued, was just beginning. The rhythmic sound of Susanna's hooves breaking through the crusted snow marked the passage of time as they traveled through a landscape that seemed reborn in the aftermath of the storm. Thomas found himself studying the child's face whenever they paused to rest, searching for clues about her personality and potential that might be hidden beneath the helpless exterior of infancy. What kind of woman would she become if she survived? Would she remember anything of her Apache heritage, or would she grow up as a stranger to her own people? These questions swirled through Thomas's mind as they made their way through the mountains, each step taking them further from the world the child had been born into and closer to one where she would be forever marked as different. The sun climbed higher in the clear sky, and the warmth began to soften the snow's surface, making travel more difficult, but also providing hope that the worst of the winter weather might be behind them. Thomas could see smoke rising from the chimney of Fort Bowie long before the buildings themselves came into view, and the sight filled him with relief and anticipation in equal measure. Soon, he would have to explain how he came to be carrying an Apache infant through the mountains, and he would have to confront the complex emotions and difficult decisions that lay ahead. But for now, in this moment between rescue and revelation, Thomas McKenna rode forward into the unknown, carrying with him a child who represented both an ending and a beginning in the long, troubled history of the American frontier.